Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, March 28th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about young voters in the 2020 election and what this could mean moving ahead into 2024 and beyond, given that we are going to be seeing a larger presence in terms of vote share for the young vote, which pretty much just includes the millennials and Generation Z. Now, looking at the 2020 election results, many Generation Z voters, or voters now but weren't voters then, could not vote in the 2020 election. As we start to get through the next decade or so, we will start to see more and more Generation Z citizens eligible to vote and register to vote and actually get out there. But as of right now, what we're looking at is that young voters pretty much made a stance in the 2020 election. What happened was that young voters turned out in a way that we had not seen over the past decade, or even beyond that. Even in terms of the young vote that came out for Obama, it wasn't as large percentage-wise as it was for Joe Biden in this election. And while polling data did reveal that many of these Generation Z and millennial voters were voting simply against Trump rather than for Biden, there were some exceptions, but that was the main takeaway there. Joe Biden was able to completely obliterate Trump in this margin, but a lot of the energy was because of Donald Trump being on the ballot and because there was that huge opposition towards him. So I'll preface this by saying that the Democratic Party needs to tap into this energy, this hatred for Donald Trump, this disdain for overall Republican policies that we've seen from Generation Z and the millennial generation. I think that it's very interesting to see how they have pretty much pushed away the ideologies of their parents and their grandparents and are sticking to it. And are absolutely sticking to it, because even though it is the stereotype that younger voters younger voters in general are more liberal, the data doesn't exactly back that. And we'll talk about that once we actually get to that point to see, what happened in previous elections and why that isn't exactly an always correct indicator of how young voters are going to vote. So on your screen, I'm showing you the Tufts University pretty much breakdown. This is from their Tisch College. You can see it at the top left. And they pretty much go through Joe Biden's victory here. And they talk about youth vote turnout and the vote per state. So first things first, we can see that based on votes counted as of November 18th, so pretty much almost all of them, right? It suggests that 52 to 55% of voting eligible young people ages 18 through 29 cast a ballot in the 2020 election. In 2016, it was 42 to 44%. So a 10-point increase in terms of overall turnout. And the majority of eligible young voters, voted in this election. So that's actually pretty good. Considering young voters typically do not vote, this is a very good sign. And what you're looking at is that, in the youth vote by state, the Democratic Party pretty much runs up the numbers. On your screen right now, I'm showing you a map that pretty much goes through almost every single state with the exception of a few. Those exceptions are Vermont, Rhode Island, West Virginia, Arkansas, North and South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Hawaii, and Alaska. These states do not provide the data. They might not have had exit polling data, at least the ones that Tufts use. I think they use Edison Research. But overall, the majority of states have them here, and it does give us some very interesting results. So what I'm actually going to do is apply this to a map and show you what the overall margin would be on the electoral map, because it would be very, very strong. And I think it would also give you a better idea of the direction that some of these states are going, because if these young voters, obviously as they get older, they will no longer be young voters, but if they hold this same type of sentiment, if they hold this same type of feeling towards the Democratic Party and towards the Republican Party, the Democrats might be in luck in the future with these young voters. That's the thing. Young voters have been driving the country to the left, and for the case of Generation Z and the millennial generation, they haven't really deviated from such shifts. They haven't really changed their minds too heavily on how they're going to vote and how they have voted in years past. So on your screen right now, you see that young voters pretty much bring Joe Biden or whichever Democratic nominee to a 439 electoral vote victory. If I add in all of the states that Joe Biden won on his own accord, you would have to include Vermont, Hawaii, and Rhode Island, which would bring the numbers up to 400, and the District of Columbia to 452 electoral votes. That's assuming that Trump wins the remaining states amongst the youth vote, but I'm going to go ahead and give it to him because we don't have any data, and he did win the states on the presidential level. But this would be our map if we were looking at strictly just young voters voting, at least voters ages 18 to 29. And this is very interesting, to say the least. Looking at this map, it's almost a complete annihilation of the Republican Party. And looking at the margins in some of these states, some of these swing states, it isn't even close, which also reveals that older voters are the reason why some of these states truly are swing states. Let's take Florida, for example. Donald Trump won the state of Florida by 3.3%. He shifted the state further to the right than 2016. So when you're looking at the victory here, Donald Trump won by 3.3%. Well, that must mean that, maybe the youth vote might be in his favor or slightly in the favor of Joe Biden, but not by a lot. Well, that'd be dead wrong. Joe Biden won 64% of the youth vote here in Florida. Donald Trump won just 34%. We're talking about a Miami-Dade County 2016 scenario here against Donald Trump. And looking at that margin, that's not good. In neighboring Georgia, a state that flipped for the first time since 1992, Joe Biden won this state by 0.23%. Looking at the margin amongst young voters, it was a 19-point margin. Was not even close. If it was 17 points, Joe Biden would have not won the state of Georgia, maybe even 18. 1 to 2% could have made all the difference. Joe Biden obliterated Trump in this state. Even South Carolina, a 10-point margin. North Carolina, a 16-point margin. Virginia, a 33-point margin. Even some other red states, long-lasting red states, right? Louisiana, youth voters back Biden by 11 points. Missouri, by 4. Iowa, by 1. Nebraska, isn't this interesting, right? 14 points. Oklahoma, 12 points. Texas, nearly 30 points. New Mexico, 21 points. Colorado, 31 points. Arizona, 22. You get the idea. You get exactly what I'm trying to tell you. Pretty much wherever you look, no matter what type of coalition, no matter what type of state, you will see the Democratic Party doing better than they did on the presidential level. Completely. Even Indiana, it was, 6 points for Trump. Kentucky, 4 points. Tennessee, 2 points. Mississippi, 8 points. If this is the future, I can tell you this. The GOP will not win future elections if they aren't able to tap into these two generations the way that they have been able to for baby boomers and other generations. You see, the thing with the Republican Party is that as they get more socially right-wing under Donald Trump, they are pushing away the electorate that is growing in terms of presence. They are counting on older, white voters that are no longer going to be the majority of the electorate in just a few decades. They always have been for the past 300 years. So looking at the, at least by that point, it'll be 300 years, nearly 300, I think 280, from a time when, it was simply just white voters voting. And then they introduced the idea of minorities voting, then women voting. For the longest time, black women had been the most disenfranchised electorate in this entire country. At the time, wasn't even considered an electorate back then. But looking at what we've seen is that we are looking at minority voters increasing in terms of overall percentage, and consequently the Democratic Party's chances of victory increase as well. And it's a combination with youth voters, but they are intertwined. The reason why the youth vote is so Democratic is because of youth voters of color. I want to show you a perfect example. Let's look at 2016. Let's look at Arizona. This is a state that was won by Joe Biden in the 2020 election. It was the second closest state in the entire country. It's a state that had flipped from 1996. So looking at Arizona, right, look at the age breakdown. 18 to 29-year-olds made up 14% of the electorate in 2016. Hillary Clinton lost this state by 3.5%. Keep that in mind. She won these voters, younger voters, by 18 points. In 2020, the year it flipped, had around a 4-point shift. 18 to 29-year-olds made up 16% of the electorate, a 2% increase. And Joe Biden won them by 31 points. 18 versus 31, an increase of 2% made all the difference. It was enough that Arizona went from being a lifelong Republican state, with one exception, to being a state that the Democratic Party was able to flip, win in 2018, and will likely retain in 2024 and beyond. Arizona went blue. Georgia went blue. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania went blue on the backs of young voters. And I think it's very interesting, to say the least. So as we look through all of these articles talking about younger voters, and on the national level, if you're wondering how they voted, younger voters, let's see here. See if we can find 18 to 29-year-olds nationwide. Maybe I skipped over it. Yes, I did. Actually, they break it down just a slight bit more, but 18 to 24-year-olds, this is mainly Generation Z, and a few millennials. That means 24-year-olds, 23-year-olds are Generation Z. There may be a few exceptions to that. I think really depends on the month. But looking at, or how they identify, it's really weird, but let's avoid that. But just looking at it, right? We're talking about a 34-point margin of victory for Joe Biden amongst voters 25 to 29, an 11-point margin. So amongst younger voters, you see, even up to ages 49, that they all went to Biden. But because older voters make up over 50% of the electorate, 50 plus makes over 50% or more of the electorate, and Joe Biden doesn't win them, and he loses them by 5 points, it brings us to a point, where we realize, hold on a second, Joe Biden isn't doing so well because these older voters, ages 50 plus, are voting for the Republican Party. But the other demographic groups are completely Democratic down the line. And it's very interesting to see. Very interesting to see. And actually, we can see up here, 18 to 29-year-olds back Joe Biden to Donald Trump by 24 points overall nationwide. So let's go ahead and take a look back at this article that I was trying to show you originally. And it pretty much just goes through, why Generation Z was hoping that this election was going to be, a big one, that they were going to have a voice. And they did. And, what was important for them? Well, I can tell you now, if you're watching this and you're a Generation Z, even if you're maybe a younger millennial, you will know that we had school shooting drills. You will know that we had time periods where we weren't sure we would be safe in our own schools. Still, we are also right at the cusp of COVID-19 directly impacted with college campuses, with schools, with everything, right? We aren't necessarily directly into the workforce, but we're still impacted enough because our parents are, our siblings are. We are stripped out of our campus experience. We are removed from the high school setting. We are removed from the middle school setting. And, looking at Generation Z, it's not just the millennial generation. Generation Z will be a huge voting bloc in the future. And this election's performance for young voters really goes to show that they are driving the entire country to the left. What's important to us was not important to baby boomers or, other generations. For the longest period of time, I can tell you this, even amongst millennial voters, Black Lives Matter was not a top issue. It was amongst Generation Z. Gun control ranked up there, but it's one of the most important ones for Generation Z because we have seen it happen. We are the only generation that has gone through elementary, middle, and high school with school shooting drills. We're the first, but we will not be the last because that's the reality of our country. And I think also climate change is a very important thing to younger voters where otherwise it isn't. So let's see here. Let's go ahead and find, I think it might be this article here where it discusses the overall idea that, younger voters simply are voting liberal because they're younger. Well, that's not true. According to Rosenberg, he says here that it's a great myth in life that young voters are liberal when they're young and then they're more conservative when they get older. And that's not actually true. Or that's actually not true. 20 years ago, 18 to 29-year-olds were 50-50 for Bush and Gore. It was dead even. Looking at what happened back then, in the year 2000, that was one of the closest elections in United States history. A very close election, right after Bill Clinton had won over young voters by a lot. He was very charismatic. Al Gore ended up being the Democratic nominee, ended up losing to George W. Bush. But looking at the youth vote, it wasn't exactly this lopsided margin where older voters were making up for it. No, that's not what happened. It was a tie. Looking at these voters, Generation Z and millennials, this is not a passing phase. That is true. The things that are important to us now will likely remain important to us. And yes, I think it is true that there is some level of change as you get older, as you leave, your parents' household, as you start to explore the world, as you start to form your own experiences. But generally speaking, those younger voters, those liberal younger voters, those, radical younger voters weren't so radical 20 years ago, weren't so radical 40 years ago. Just because they're breaking the status quo doesn't necessarily mean that they're liberal. It just means that they weren't exactly following, exactly what they were being told. But amongst younger voters now, they are doing more than just breaking the status quo. We're looking at younger voters introduce new ideologies, introduce new platforms, winning primaries, right? We have millennials in Congress that have ousted long-term incumbents. We will have Generation Z representatives in the future. We will have Generation Z senators, and they will make up a huge voting bloc. And I also want to bring you to the point that Generation Z is the most diverse we've seen. Out of recent generations, Generation Z is the most diverse in the entire nation. Let's take a look. Gen Zers are 52% white. Yes, that is a majority. But millennials, 61%. Gen Xers, 70%. Baby boomers, 82%. Looking at the numbers here, looking at the breakdown, what you notice is that Generation Z is the most diverse. The highest percentage of Asian citizens. Nearly the highest percentage of black citizens. 25% of them are Hispanic. That means 1 in 4. You go to Generation Z around the country, 1 in every 4 will be Hispanic. Isn't that interesting? Up from 17% amongst millennials, up from 12% amongst Gen Xers, and those before, 4%. It's very interesting to see that minorities have grown in terms of population and in terms of representation. And as we start to see Generation Z become a very major electorate, you have to realize with this new demographic breakdown of it being very, very, very diverse, it gets more democratic. Because nationally speaking, it's not just young voters where we see this heavy divide. It's amongst minority citizens. White voters are the only demographic group that back the Republican Party. It's the only demographic group that backs the Republican Party, 58 to 41. They make up 67% of the electorate, but once Generation Z and generations following start to become the majority of the electorate, you will see that 52% number will start to become a lot closer than 67%. They will start to converge into a point where the overall respondents and the overall percentage of voters in this country that are white will be below 50 points, around 2040, 2050. As of right now, it's 67%, which is why all these other demographic groups can split for the Democrats heavily, 87 to 12, 65 to 32, 61 to 34, 55 to 41, and white voters will still counteract that and make it super competitive. But the realistic part is, as young voters, millennials and Generation Z, two of the most diverse generations in a long time, the most diverse in American history, Generation Z. Second most diverse is millennials. Looking at how minority voters have voted in the 2020 election, in the 2016 election, it doesn't matter when it is, 2012, 2008, 2004, typically speaking, they always break for the Democratic Party. White voters, however, do not. Young voters are going to be moving the needle to the left, moving the country to the left. As we see on this map, even if the Republican Party is able to reclaim some of these states, they're already at a tremendous deficit amongst young voters. As we have seen, young voters haven't always been super liberal. They have the stereotype of being so, but the data does not necessarily back that up. Now, it's 100% backing that up. And looking at the margins, it's absolutely resounding for Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. Because they're looking at this and saying, we can tap into these young voters. And if they hold this sentiment now, as long as the Democratic Party maintains their image and the Republican Party doesn't deviate much, and chances are they won't considering that they're going heavy for Trump at the moment, I think that young voters, which will soon be older voters, will hold this same type of voting style, which will drive the country to the left and force the Republican Party to reevaluate its current positions. But it's not just the Democratic breakdown. It's also amongst those enrolled in college and those who have college-educated parents. Generation Z says that, those who are no longer in high school, 57% of them are in college. Millennials were 52%. That's the highest we've seen. Amongst those living with their parents, 44% of them are living with a parent who has at least a bachelor's degree. If you don't know this, this is true. College-educated voters back the Democratic Party more than non-college educated voters. Looking at the most educated states, we see that the Democratic Party performs the best. But I am not trying to draw the conclusion that because you're educated, you are inherently a Democratic voter. I think a lot of that is rooted in elitism. I don't think we should really be arguing that point. I don't really think any political party should be arguing that point. I do cringe when I see those, because thinking about that, it's essentially saying that because you're not educated, you're a Republican, or, trying to imply that when you vote Republican, you're uneducated. You see, it's a slippery slope there. I don't think it's right to say, but it is true, though, that college-educated voters do vote for the Democratic Party more than non-college educated voters. But I don't think we should be directly trying to correlate that due to college education. But I do think that because we do see somewhat of a more liberal tone among college-educated voters, it could be for a number of issues, a number of reasons. their children will likely be more Democratic, just having that parental influence. We all know in our civics classes that parents hold the first and foremost influence on their child's political beliefs, and that's what we're seeing here. So I'm not trying to say any of that stuff. I don't really think it's not a good argument. I'm just pointing out that, there are numbers that show it, but I don't think they're more liberal because they went to college, if that makes sense, right? So moving on beyond that, what we can see is that also they talk about climate change. Generation Z, thinks about climate change to be very, very important. Also, race relations. This is a huge thing. In the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, we have seen the younger voters. See, this is before the this article was written before, actually. So just take that into consideration. But looking amongst Generation Z, what you notice is that even the Republican Party, 43% of them amongst Generation Z acknowledge that black citizens are treated less fairly than white citizens. And of course, the Democratic Party has always had that stance, at least for right now, at least amongst our current party affiliation. And I think it's very telling to see that Generation Z has the most amount of their, group that believes that black citizens are treated less fairly than white citizens. And I think that's going to be very important to keep in mind, because it also might imply that they might be pushing for more societal change, whereas other generations would not be okay with it. And then amongst same-sex marriage, we've seen that Generation Z is the most accepting, whatever it might be. Generation Z seems to be having different types of societal beliefs and social standards and social norms that other generations aren't exactly okay with or don't exactly approve of. And at the end of the day, as Generation Z and the millennial generation get more and more, hold more and more of a presence on the national stage and on the vote share stage, I think that they are going to see this entire country shift to the left and force the Republican Party to rethink some of their key positions. Because we have seen the Republican Party move to the left relative to 2004, 2000, 1996. They could hold a lot more right-wing beliefs before, where otherwise they can't now, because it just simply isn't feasible. With young voters taking up more and more of the electorate as the days progress, weeks progress, months progress. I mean, you could see a huge difference in just 4 to 8 years, in just 2 elections. The Republican Party is trying to pander, and they need to pander if they want to have a realistic chance at winning in the future. But the main takeaway, young voters as of right now are driving the country to the left. We will see if that holds through the next few elections. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.